Under a pale winter sky, Ashworth House holds its breath. Servants move like shadows. Silence rules every corridor. At the center stands Dorothea, the marble duchess, her heart locked as tightly as her household. Then a new presence crosses the threshold. Samuel Barrett, a cook with steady eyes and a past he will not name. One held glance, and the porcelain order begins to crack. Whispers coil beneath the stairs. An old grievance stirs. A choice gathers on the horizon, duty and reputation, or the dangerous pull of truth and desire. Something unsent waits in a drawer. Something unresolved returns to knock. Are you ready to step inside? Tell us where you're listening from and what you love most about historical romance. Bath, England, the year of our Lord, 1862. A light mist clung to the stone walls of Ashworth House, veiling its towering silhouette in an eerie stillness that seemed to echo the silence within. The estate stood grand and unmoved atop the rolling hills just beyond the city, where the air was damp with the breath of early spring, and the branches of the oaks trembled with memories. Servants moved like shadows through the corridors, their footsteps soft, rehearsed, almost reverent, less from loyalty and more from fear. At the heart of it all was she, Dorothea, Duchess of Ashworth, widow, mistress, and unchallenged sovereign of that somber house, sat rigid in her high-backed chair by the morning-room window, her pale fingers wrapped delicately around a porcelain teacup she had not touched. Her gown, a stormy shade of grey silk, cascaded in perfect folds around her, the fabric as stiff as the expression on her sculpted face. Her hair, swept into an elegant braided coil at the nape of her neck, gleamed with the faintest hints of chestnut beneath the grey daylight. To the outside world, she was still a woman of formidable beauty, tall, poised, and impossibly composed. But within Ashworth House, her name inspired something colder than admiration. They called her the Marble Duchess. Not just for her statuesque bearing, but for the chill in her voice, the absence in her eyes, and the way even her children's laughter died beneath the weight of her silence. Edward, her eldest, stood by the hearth reading from a volume of Latin, his auburn head bent in solemn obedience. He was 12, yet the line of his mouth was already fixed in the habits of restraint. Eliza, 9, sat at her embroidery with small, clumsy stitches, casting careful glances at her mother, always waiting, always fearing correction that might come without warning. The door opened without a sound. Miss Trumbull, the housekeeper, entered with her usual discreet firmness, a clipboard pressed to her chest. "Your Grace," she said with a slight curtsy, "the new cook has arrived. He is not what I expected." Dorothea did not turn her head. "Incompetent?" "No," Miss Trumbull replied, her voice lowering with something close to hesitation. "Capable, but he carries himself oddly, not as a servant." That caught Dorothea's attention. She looked up slowly, her eyes pale and penetrating. "We have no need for arrogance below stairs, Miss Trumbull. See that it is corrected swiftly." "Yes, Your Grace." And yet, Miss Trumbull lingered a second too long, as if uncertain how to voice the thought resting behind her lips. But she curtsied again and left without further comment. Below, in the warmth of the kitchen, Samuel Barrett had arrived without fanfare, though every scullery maid and footman had already whispered his name. He was not young, but not old, perhaps in his early 40s, with a quiet strength in his shoulders and a calmness in his gaze that unsettled more than it soothed. His hair was dark and dusted with grey at the temples, and he wore his linen shirt neatly, sleeves rolled to the forearms, revealing hands calloused by work, but steady as a surgeon's. He said little, but what he said was listened to. He did not flinch under Miss Trumbull's scrutiny. He nodded, asked to see the larder, and inquired after the quality of the flour with the seriousness of a physician diagnosing an ailment. The kitchen staff, half impressed and half confused, obeyed without question. There was something in him, not pride, but dignity, an unfamiliar presence in a house where dignity belonged only to the bloodline. At precisely 11, the Duchess descended. She never moved quickly, nor with softness. Her steps echoed like a metronome across the stone floor of the lower corridor. She did not visit the kitchens often, but a broken line in the supply books had demanded her attention, and Dorothea rarely entrusted anyone to do what she could verify herself. The doors to the kitchen swung open. Samuel turned. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, just one, time bent. Her gaze, meant to dismiss, faltered. His gaze, calm and unwavering, did not fall. It held, not with defiance but with presence. The kind of presence no man had dared show her in over a decade. It was not boldness. It was not flirtation. It was equality, and it sent a tremor through her spine that she would never admit. Dorothea blinked once. "See to the accounts," she told Miss Trumbull, "and remind the staff, appearances are not to be trusted." She turned, her skirts whispering across the floor, and left the room. Samuel watched her go. He said nothing, but in his silence, something unspoken passed like smoke between them, an awareness, uninvited and entirely unforgettable. Upstairs, Edward had paused his reading. Eliza had set down her needle. Something had shifted. A current, silent but certain, had begun to stir within the great stone bones of Ashworth House, and no one, least of all the Duchess, could stop what had already begun. The rain began before dawn, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the high windows of Ashworth House, as though the sky itself had begun to weep for something it could not name. It filled the corridors with a damp heaviness, made the hearths smoke faintly, and turned the already solemn house into a place of whispered tension. In the kitchens, steam rose from boiling pots, and the clatter of copper pans fought against the silence that always thickened when the hour of the Duchess's inspection drew near. It was the day of the monthly family dinner, a formal affair in which everything from the linens to the lemon custard was expected to meet Dorothea's impossible standards. The air was taut with urgency. Servants moved swiftly, speaking in low voices. The kitchen smelled of roasted meat, rising dough and candle wax. At the far end, near the stone basin, Molly Green, the scullery maid, worked with trembling hands, scrubbing parsnips in water that had long turned grey with soil. She was 17, pale and bird-like, with auburn hair tucked beneath a too loose cap, and eyes that flickered like a candle about to go out. Behind her, Samuel Barrett stirred a thick sauce with methodical care. His sleeves were rolled once again, his forearms dusted with flour and speckled with the heat of the ovens. He said little. He observed everything. His calm presence had begun to shift the rhythm of the kitchen since his arrival, a rhythm Dorothea Whitmore, Duchess of Ashworth, did not appreciate. "Mind the fire," he murmured to one of the boys, not looking up. Molly, glancing over at him, allowed herself a breath, a small one. The cook's voice never rose. He didn't bark orders like the previous man. He didn't throw things. But there was a gravity in his quiet that made people listen. At the 10th hour, Miss Trumbull descended with her clipboard, like a sword drawn from a scabbard. "Her Grace will be coming to inspect the preparations. Stand straight. Speak only if spoken to." No one needed reminding, but everyone nodded. By the 11th hour, the tension was unbearable. The Duchess's heels clicked down the hallway like the toll of a clock. When she entered, the kitchen froze. She wore a gown of slate blue silk, high-collared and severe, with dark velvet trim along the cuffs. Her hair, tightly drawn into a braided twist, revealed a neck held high and unmoved by the warmth of the room. Her gaze swept over the staff with the precision of a blade. No smiles, no greetings. She stepped forward, hands clasped in front of her, eyes resting briefly on each dish as Miss Trumbull listed them aloud. Pheasant, roasted in juniper, creamed potatoes with bay and thyme, duck consommé with pearl onions, tart of lemon and lavender to follow. "The bread, still in the oven, Your Grace," said Samuel, his tone respectful but even. She turned her eyes to him fully for the first time since their last encounter. Her gaze was cold, unreadable. "Let us hope you remember salt this time." A few servants lowered their eyes, pretending not to hear the edge in her voice. Then, without warning, her attention snapped to Molly. The girl had dropped a single spoon. It clattered against the stone floor, harmless, almost imperceptible. But in the quiet that followed, it might as well have been a bell-tolling doom. "You," Dorothea said. Molly froze. "I've warned you before about clumsiness." Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. The precision with which she enunciated each syllable was enough to draw blood. I'm sorry, Your Grace." Sorry is meaningless when you repeat the same idiocy. Perhaps you should consider whether this house is too grand for your meager talents. Molly's eyes welled up. She bent her head, ashamed. "Your Grace," Samuel's voice interrupted, level, unwavering. The room stopped breathing. Dorothea turned to him slowly, as if the very air had betrayed her. The fire crackled in the hearth. Rain ticked against the windows. She did not speak. Samuel stepped forward, not too close, not defiantly, but with deliberate calm. She dropped a spoon. Nothing was damaged, and she has worked without pause since before the sun rose. Surely that deserves a measure of grace. Gasps were swallowed behind aprons. Even Miss Trumble's eyes flicked wide before she masked them again. Dorothea stared at him, as if seeing him for the first time. He did not lower his gaze. He did not apologize. And yet, there was no challenge in his eyes, only a quiet demand for fairness. It was not the tone of a servant. It was the tone of a man who had once commanded respect and still did. Eliza and Edward, who had entered the kitchen behind their mother without being noticed, now stood in the doorway, eyes wide. Edward looked from Samuel to his mother and back again. Eliza gripped her brother's sleeve. A moment passed, and then another. Dorothea straightened. "You are out of place, Mr. Barrett." "I'm in the kitchen, Your Grace, the place assigned to me." His words struck like velvet gloves, soft but unyielding. She held his gaze. Her face, that beautiful mask of composure, trembled at the edges, just slightly. Then, turning to Miss Trumbull, she spoke with chilling calm. "See that the spoon is cleaned properly, and that this cook remembers his station." She swept out without another word, her skirts hissing behind her like the threat of thunder. Her children followed silently, without a backward glance. The door closed, and still no one moved. Molly bit her lip, eyes shining with silent gratitude. Samuel returned to the source. Miss Trumbull inhaled once, then exhaled long. Back to work. That night the house seemed darker. Rain tapped steadily on the roof, and the wind whispered against the glass. Upstairs, in her private study, Dorothea sat at her writing desk, a blank sheet of paper before her. Her pen hovered, then touched down with graceful precision. "Mr. Barrett," she paused. Her hand trembled. How dare he? How dare he speak to her in front of the others, in front of her children? She set the pen down, pushed the paper away, rose from her chair. But the paper remained there, half addressed, untouched. She looked out the window into the darkness. Her reflection stared back at her, but it was not the same woman who had begun that day with unshakable certainty. No, there was a crack now, thin, invisible to the world, but she felt it. She felt it like a thread, unraveling from within. She had been cold for so long. For so many years her word had been law, her silence a weapon, her dignity a wall none could scale. And now there was a man in her kitchen who did not fear her, who looked at her not as a duchess, but as a woman. She turned from the window, blew out the candle, and left the paper where it lay. The morning after the storm was pale and still, as if the world itself held its breath. A thin veil of mist hovered above the gardens of Ashworth House, shrouding the hedgerows and gravel paths in a hushed softness that neither sun nor wind dared disturb. Inside the estate, the servants moved quietly, their steps lighter, uncertain whether the echo of the previous day's confrontation had truly settled or simply receded into the walls. Yet in the kitchen, the rhythm had resumed with an almost unnatural calm. Samuel Barrett stood at the hearth, his sleeves rolled once more to the elbows, his hands steady as he kneaded dough with slow, deliberate pressure. The air was thick with the scent of fresh yeast and lemon rind, and the warmth from the oven had driven away the last traces of dawn's chill. He worked alone for now, the other servants hesitant to crowd him after what had transpired. Their gazes hovered over him from corners and corridors, flickering with awe, curiosity, and something close to unease. But Samuel did not speak. He did not complain, and he did not explain. Only Molly lingered near, wordless and loyal, wiping down the wooden table beside him with careful strokes. Every so often she would glance up at his face, searching for some sign of turmoil beneath his quiet focus. But he offered none. He rarely did. Because Samuel Barrett was a man who had learned the price of speaking too soon. Not so long ago, he had stood in a different kitchen, his own, a fine establishment on the edge of Somerset, an inn built with years of sweat and quiet ambition. There, he had moved among townsfolk and travellers, served roasted duck and rhubarb pies to the daughters of lesser gentry, and poured glasses of brandy for passing clergymen. And beside him, always smiling and humming old songs under her breath, had been Margaret, his wife, his peace, his reason, until the night the Ashworth crest arrived on the side of a gilded carriage. The guests had been noble, impatient, careless. There had been a dispute, a confrontation, and by dawn, a lie had taken root. A whisper of theft, of insolence, of disrespect. A whisper powerful enough to cost him everything. Margaret fell ill within weeks and never recovered. The inn was seized. His name ruined. He had never received justice, but Samuel did not seek revenge. He sought truth, and truth, he had learned, always began with silence and observation. When word reached him that Lord Cedric Ashworth, the younger brother of the late Duke, had returned from overseas and was overseeing certain family affairs, Samuel inquired quietly and learned of a position available at Ashworth House. He did not hesitate. Now here he was, covered in flour, feeding noble children, and studying the rhythm of a house that had once destroyed his life. And still, he waited. Above stairs, Dorothea stood before her dressing mirror, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the carved mahogany frame. Her gown for the day, a deep plum wool trimmed with silk piping, was already fastened, though she had not yet put on her gloves. Behind her, the lady's maid finished arranging her hair into a low braided twist, as ordered. The Duchess stared at her own reflection with narrowed eyes. Her mind, always sharp, always disciplined, was unsettled. She had slept little. The cook's words echoed in her ears, unwelcome and unforgettable. She hated how calm he had remained, hated how he had looked at her, not with rebellion, not with fear, but with conviction, as though he were seeing past the title, past the coldness she wore like armor, and glimpsing the woman beneath. And that gaze, unwavering and steady, had lingered. She had never tolerated scrutiny, not even from herself. "Has Edward gone down yet?" she asked sharply. "I believe he is in the library, Your Grace," replied the maid, her voice cautious. Dorothea gave a brief nod and turned toward the door. She needed control. Of her thoughts, her children, and her house. She needed the ground to be firm beneath her feet again. In the library, Edward sat cross-legged on the rug beside the hearth, an open atlas resting on his lap. His reddish-brown hair fell into his eyes as he traced the roots of distant rivers with the tip of his finger. He was a serious boy, far too observant for his age, and far too silent for her comfort. "Good morning, Mother," he said without looking up. Dorothea crossed the room and paused behind him. "What are you reading?" "Geography. Mr. Barrett gave me a list of places he's traveled. I wanted to see if they matched." She stiffened. "He gave you a list?" "Well, not a list. He just mentioned names. Lyon, Cadiz, Tangier. He said he once sailed along the Portuguese coast." She frowned, watching her son's finger glide across the blue ink of the sea. "You've spoken to him?" "Yes," Edward said simply. "He listens." It struck her like a stone. "And you find it appropriate to form friendships with the kitchen staff?" Edward turned then, blinking up at her, unsure whether he had stepped into dangerous ground. "I didn't think it was about friendship. He just explains things. When I ask..." Dorothea inhaled sharply, turning away. A servant who offered geography lessons, a child who found more warmth in the kitchen than in the drawing room. Something was shifting, something she did not approve of, but could no longer ignore. Later that day, as the sun bled slowly through the clouds, Eliza wandered down the servant staircase, unseen. She had always been the quieter of the two children. Where Edward questioned, Eliza observed. Her small hands clasped the wooden banister as she tiptoed toward the kitchens, her doll tucked under her arm. At the bottom step, she stopped. Samuel was kneeling beside the fire, turning a cast-iron pan with the slow ease of someone who had long stopped rushing life. The smell of warm cinnamon filled the air. Eliza did not speak, but she made no effort to hide. He turned, sensing her, and smiled. "I thought I heard the pitter-patter of someone brave," he said. She stepped forward, shy but curious. "Are you making cinnamon apples?" "I am. For supper. They smell like the ones Papa liked." Samuel paused. "Your father had good taste then." She lowered her eyes. "Mother doesn't like them sweet. She says it spoils the tongue." He smiled gently. "Well, I say sweetness is a necessary rebellion." She giggled before she could help herself. It was a small sound, but it was a sound that had not been heard in that kitchen in years. Upstairs, in her private parlor, Dorothea stood at the window watching the mist lift from the garden paths. Her fingers tapped the sill once, twice. The house was quieter than usual, but not in the way she preferred. There was a different silence now, one that buzzed beneath the surface, not of fear, but of movement. And though she would never say it aloud, not even to herself, she felt it in her bones. He had changed something, not with force, not with charm, but with stillness. And stillness, she realized, was far more dangerous than noise. She turned from the window and reached for her gloves. If Samuel Barrett thought he could alter the pulse of Ashworth House from below stairs, she would remind him, firmly, elegantly, that the Duchess did not yield. But the paper she had begun to write the night before still sat in the drawer, unfinished, untouched. The morning broke with an uneasy hush, the kind that made birds delay their song, and servants glanced twice at the sky before opening the shutters. A sharp breeze threaded through the hills surrounding Ashworth House, scattering the golden leaves that clung stubbornly to the chestnut trees and brushing against the high windows as if to whisper a warning. Dorothea, Duchess of Ashworth, had risen early, as was her custom. She stood at the tall windows of her morning room, her figure erect, wrapped in a dressing gown of deep burgundy velvet. A china cup rested in her hand, though the tea had long grown cold. Her gaze did not move from the distant road that led to the estate gates, where a thin column of dust stirred in the distance. She did not yet know why, but she felt it. A change was coming. Downstairs, the household stirred with the rhythm of routine. Bread dough rising in the kitchen, linen being pressed in the scullery, fires being stoked in every hearth. Samuel Barrett, ever steady, worked in near silence, instructing the undercook with a glance, tasting a broth with a flick of the wrist, correcting the angle of a blade as if conducting an orchestra. His presence had become a quiet anchor, grounding the kitchen staff in something rare. Dignity. He felt the shift too, though he could not name it. It was not until the clock struck 9 that the first sound of hooves echoed through the courtyard stones. The carriage arrived without herald, its black lacquered panels gleaming like a raven's wing, the crest of House Ashworth emblazoned in crimson and gold upon the door. 2 footmen leapt from their positions to open it, though no one had been informed of any visitor. From within stepped Lord Cedric Ashworth. He emerged as if the estate belonged to him still. Tall, lean and immaculate, in a tailored frock coat of charcoal wool, with gloves the color of bone and a silk cravat tied with merciless precision. His dark blonde hair, streaked with silver, was swept back, and his eyes, clear, calculating, scanned the courtyard like a general inspecting troops. The servants at the door bowed low. "Is Her Grace at home?" he asked, his voice smooth as polished marble. No one dared say otherwise. Dorothea descended the grand staircase moments later. Her gown changed to a sober grey silk trimmed in jet beading. The lines of her bodice were severe, her expression unreadable. "Cedric," she said, her tone neither warm nor cold. "What brings you here so early? I was not made aware of your visit. Had I sent word, you might have refused me," he replied with a tight smile, removing his gloves finger by finger. "And I wished to surprise my nephews. I've not seen them in too long." She studied him carefully. "They are in their lessons." "Naturally," he murmured. "So well disciplined, just like their mother." She did not flinch, but her grip on the banister tightened. "I assume you'll be staying the night." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of imposing. I merely wish to walk the halls again. There's something comforting about the scent of old books and rose polish. Though I confess," he said, stepping closer, "I'm curious how well the estate is being managed." But the smile did not reach his eyes. Dorothea tilted her chin slightly. "You'll find it managed efficiently and without indulgence." Of course," he said, glancing around the entryway with theatrical admiration. "You've done well, considering." That word lingered between them like a stain. Later, as the house settled into the strange rhythm of hosting an uninvited guest, Lord Cedric moved like a ghost through its halls, greeting footmen by name, lingering near the parlor where Eliza played her scales, commenting on the curtains in the east corridor. He paused longest in the kitchen. He entered without knocking, startling the staff. Samuel, who had been slicing root vegetables in silence, looked up slowly, his hands stilled. "And you must be the new cook," Cedric said, stepping further into the warm space. "Barrett, was it?" "Yes, my lord. You speak like a man educated above his station." "I've lived a long life, my lord." Cedric tilted his head, examining him with the predatory calm of a hawk. "And what brought you to Ashworth House, Mr. Barrett?" Samuel met his gaze evenly. "Opportunity." Cedric smiled faintly. "How admirable. So many of your class speak only of necessity." "Opportunity is necessity," Samuel replied, "when you've lost what you once held." For a heartbeat, the room froze. Cedric's eyes narrowed. Then, with a flick of his glove, he turned and addressed Miss Trumbull, who had just entered from the cellar. "Tell me, madam, how long has this man been in your employ?" "Just under 3 months, my lord," she answered, her voice cautious. Cedric glanced again at Samuel, then slowly exited, the echo of his steps lingering long after he had gone. Samuel exhaled only when the door closed behind him. That night, as the rain returned in soft pattering bursts against the windows, Dorothea sat alone in the study. A letter unfolded before her. The ink had faded with time, but she knew its every word by heart. It was the letter of formal petition, Cedric's petition, submitted to the Crown Estate Court the year her husband had died, requesting that guardianship of Edward and Eliza be granted to him on the basis of her emotional fragility and unsuitability as a woman of independent charge. The request had been denied, of course, but not without stain. He had never forgiven her for winning. Now he had returned. With polite smiles, with veiled observations, with questions that did not sound like questions. And she knew men like Cedric did not knock on doors they could kick down. She rose from her desk and paced to the hearth, her hands curled into fists at her sides. Her reflection danced in the mirror above the mantel, elegant, composed, and utterly alone. Outside, in the dark corridor, Edward listened. The crack beneath the study door cast the golden flicker of firelight on his slippers. His heart pounded, and further down the servants' wing, Samuel sat at his small desk, a single candle illuminating a page in front of him. He wrote slowly, methodically, copying names, dates, figures. entries from the pantry logs that did not match the estate's annual ledgers. Quietly, he added 2 names at the bottom of the list, vendors he had once seen listed under Lord Cedric's former accounts, when the inn was still his. His handwriting was steady, his expression was not. He had come to Ashworth House for truth, and now he had found its first crack. The snow began to fall just after noon, not the cruel kind that punished roads and toppled chimneys, but the quiet, silken sort, soft as lace and twice as deceptive. It blanketed the roofs of Ashworth House in white velvet, dusted the manicured hedges like sugared confections, and muffled the sounds of carriage wheels arriving through the wrought iron gates. Inside, the chandeliers blazed with golden light. Footmen in crisp livery moved like chess pieces between parlour and corridor, trays of crystal glasses balanced with practiced grace. Laughter drifted from room to room, polished, well-trained laughter that belonged more to obligation than joy. Gentlemen in tailored coats gathered near the hearths, discussing politics they could not change. Ladies with necks stiffened by velvet collars adjusted their fans and pretended not to glance toward one another's jewels. Dorothea, Duchess of Ashworth, stood at the top of the grand staircase, her gown a deep garnet satin that shimmered like spilled wine in the candlelight. The bodice was modest, high-necked, adorned only with jet beads that glittered like tears. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and around her throat she wore a mourning cameo, though no one dared ask for whom she still wore black. She was flawless, untouchable, and utterly alone. With a gloved hand resting lightly on the carved banister, she descended with practiced composure. Guests turned their heads as they always did and offered polite smiles that never reached their eyes. She returned them with the exact measure of interest society demanded, no more, no less. In the drawing room, Lord Cedric Ashworth held court with a group of widows and baronets, his smile as polished as his boots. He raised his glass slightly when he saw her approach, his eyes gleaming with that same veiled amusement he had worn since his arrival. "Her grace outshines even the frost," he said smoothly. Dorothea offered a cool smile. "Let us hope the frost is more forgiving." The room chuckled, and the game resumed. But Samuel Barrett, who watched from behind the edge of the servant corridor, did not laugh. He stood half-hidden beside a service door near the dining hall, where he had no business remaining, save for the excuse of overseeing the final course. He wore no coat, no gloves, just the plain white shirt and dark waistcoat of the kitchen. And yet, in that moment, he could have been wearing a crown for all the command in his stillness. His eyes did not follow the laughter. They followed her. He watched the way her fingers curled too tightly around her glass, the way her smile hovered just a second too long on nothing, the way her eyes, those cold silver-blue eyes, flinched only when no one was looking. He saw it, the crack beneath the surface. Later that evening, as the final toast was made and guests were gathered near the staircase for their cloaks, Dorothea slipped away. She moved through the corridors like a woman underwater, silent, graceful, unseen. In her right hand, she carried a small, unmarked sheet of music folded into quarters. The house was still humming behind her. The laughter, the music, the flirtations, all of it still lingering like perfume in the air. But she walked toward the one room where none of it could reach her, the music room. It had once been her favorite space, long ago, before widowhood had claimed her voice and society had carved silence into her soul. The grand pianoforte still waited beneath a dust cover, its keys untouched for years, its melodies long buried beneath mourning and duty. She lit the candelabra with trembling fingers, unfolded the sheet, sat. The first note came like a confession, stiff, uncertain but real, then another. And another. Her hands, gloved in fine lace, struggled to recall the motions. The melody stumbled, then broke entirely. She stopped, closed her eyes, tried again. This time the sound wavered, fragile but full of longing. Behind her the door creaked open. She froze, her back stiffened, but she did not turn. "I thought no one came here anymore," came Samuel's voice, low and hushed. Not a question, not a challenge, a presence. Dorothea did not answer at once. "It's easier to mourn in silence," she said. He stepped inside, leaving the door ajar behind him. "Easier, perhaps," he replied, "but not kinder." His words hung in the air between them. She rose slowly, her eyes fixed on the keys. "This room doesn't belong to me anymore." "You were playing," he said gently. "That makes it yours." She turned at last, her face pale in the candlelight. The shadows played along her cheekbones, softening the sharpness that society admired, but no child could rest against. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He did not step closer. Curiosity, perhaps. Habit. The sound of something human. She lowered her gaze. Silence pressed in around them like snow. "You shouldn't be here," she said at last, though there was no weight in it. He nodded, but did not leave. "Was it something you used to play for your children?" "No," she replied. "It was something I played before I became this." There was no need to explain. He understood. She saw it in the way his expression softened, not with pity, but with recognition, as if he too had once been something else. "Who taught you?" she asked suddenly, needing to shift the weight of his gaze. "My wife," he said without hesitation. Dorothea blinked. "She played the pianoforte?" "No, she taught me how to listen." There was something devastating in the simplicity of it, and Dorothea, who had not allowed a man to speak of a wife in her presence for years, did not flinch. She moved to the window instead, her hands folded before her. The snow fell heavier now, cloaking the garden in white. "I often imagine my husband standing at that fountain," she said softly, "as he was the night before he left for the coast. He wore a blue coat. His hands were cold, but he still removed one glove to hold mine. He said he would return before the leaves turned." Samuel said nothing. He never did. Silence filled the room once more. When she turned again, he was watching her not as a servant watched a mistress, but as a man saw a woman and understood her grief without trying to tame it. "I should go," she whispered. He nodded, but his eyes did not move from hers. She walked past him slowly, her shoulder nearly brushing his. The moment held, suspended, and then it passed. She stepped out, closed the door behind her, and ran, not down the corridor, but to her study. She sat at her writing desk, heart pounding. She reached for parchment, for the pen, and she wrote furiously, desperately. She wrote what she had never said aloud, about the ache of silence, about the weight of her name, about a man who stood without fear in a room that had long silenced everyone else. She wrote to him, but she did not sign it. And when the ink dried, she folded the letter, sealed it without address, and placed it in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of forgotten receipts. Then she extinguished the candle and let the night swallow her whole. The frost had come early that morning, clinging like ghost breath to the hedgerows and silvering the glass of the greenhouse windows. In the stillness of dawn, the estate of Ashworth stood stoic and mute, but beneath its polished veneer, something began to shift, something colder than the winter air and far more difficult to sweep away. Inside the house, whispers moved faster than fire ever could. They crawled through servant corridors and slipped beneath doors, coiling around teacups and aprons. They hung in the laundry room, clung to the pantry shelves, and rested in the corners of drawing rooms like dust no one dared disturb aloud. Molly Green, her arms now healed from the burn, bent over a basin in the scullery. She scrubbed silver with careful strokes, the rhythm of her hands steady, though her breath caught every few minutes. Not from pain, but from fear. She had heard it again. "Cook thinks he's something more than he is," one of the older footmen had muttered, not 10 minutes before, his voice low but cruel. "Struts about like the Duchess owes him something." "She does owe him," another had whispered, sharp with bitterness. "A thank you, sure, for carrying her daughter out of the fire, but now he lingers like smoke after the blaze. Have you noticed how she looks at him? Or how he looks at her?" A third had chimed in. Molly's fingers clenched the cloth in her hands. Her cheeks flushed hot with fury and shame, not for herself, but for Samuel, who had never spoken above necessity, never crossed a line, never treated anyone in the house with anything but calm dignity. He had stood between her and humiliation once, and now it seemed that very strength had become his undoing. She straightened slowly and turned toward the hallway. She needed air. On the second floor, Eliza Ashworth tiptoed past the study, her doll tucked under one arm and a folded scrap of paper in the other. She moved lightly, though not with mischief. She was not the sort of child who snuck about for sport. Eliza carried the weight of silence like her mother did, but hers was not cold. It was watchful, wounded. She slipped into the nursery, where Molly now stood, hands still damp, eyes distant. Eliza tugged on her sleeve. "Miss Molly," she whispered. The young maid blinked and turned, softening instantly. "Yes, sweet one?" Eliza unfolded the paper. It was a drawing, clumsy, heartfelt. A woman with a bun and a long dress stood beside two children in a garden. The woman had a smile, wide, joyful. "I drew it for Mama," Eliza said, "because I don't remember her smiling like that, but I think maybe she used to. A long time ago." Molly knelt, her eyes stinging. "That's a beautiful drawing, Miss Eliza." The child hesitated. "Do you think she'll like it?" "I think she'll cry," Molly replied, "and say it's just a silly picture, but then she'll keep it in her drawer and never throw it away." Eliza nodded solemnly, as though she understood the strange ways of grown-ups far too well for her age. Downstairs, the kitchen was quieter than usual. Samuel Barrett stood near the hearth, going over the morning's provisions with a pencil tucked behind his ear and a thin ledger balanced in one hand. His face, calm as always, showed no trace of the tension that churned beneath his skin. He had heard the whispers too. He had caught them sliding beneath conversation like a snake in the grass, soft suggestions that his presence was too bold, his eyes too direct, his silences too loud. And though he said nothing, he had begun to notice the difference in the way the younger maids no longer made eye contact, the way the footman answered him with clipped replies. The way Miss Trumbull paused before speaking to him now, as though measuring not only his words, but hers. He had not changed, but the house had, and it was no accident. In the small parlour near the south wing, Miss Trumbull stood stiffly before the Duchess, her gloved hands folded over her waist. Her lips were pursed, her tone neutral, but her message clear. "Your Grace," she began, "forgive the boldness, but as your housekeeper, I feel it my duty to mention the staff have begun to speculate." Dorothea, seated near the window with her back straight and her fingers folded in her lap, did not look up. "About what?" Miss Trumbull hesitated. "About Mr. Barrett and your attentiveness to his work." The Duchess's eyes did not waver from the frost gathering at the edge of the pane. "My attentiveness to his work is necessary. I do not tolerate mediocrity." "Of course, Your Grace," Trumbull replied, her voice tightening. "But you must understand, servants talk, and their talking will not stay below stairs forever." Dorothea rose slowly, her figure wrapped in a gown of dark green wool, its collar fastened with a single brooch carved in jet. She turned toward her housekeeper with the full force of her composure. "They may speak," she said coldly. "It will not change what I require of him." And with that, she dismissed her, but her hands trembled as she clasped them behind her back. That evening, when the house had quieted and the wind pressed against the windows like a jealous lover, Samuel found her. She was in the corridor leading to the library, standing near the oil portrait of her late husband. The flickering sconces painted her in amber and shadow. Her expression was hard to read. He stopped a few feet away, his posture respectful. "I know," he said quietly. She turned, startled. "You know what? That they're whispering, that they're twisting glances into sins." She said nothing. "I don't blame them," he continued. "People fear what does not fit the mold." Dorothea's chin lifted. "And what mold do you believe you don't fit?" He hesitated only a moment. "The one that says a man of my position must lower his eyes." must not speak unless spoken to, must pretend he doesn't see what he sees. She stepped forward, her eyes flashing. "And what is it you see, Mr. Barrett?" He did not answer at once, but when he did, his voice was low, firm. "A woman who carries a silence heavy enough to crush an empire, and still chooses to bear it every day." She drew in a breath, sharp as winter. "And what do you think I should do with that silence?" she asked. "Whatever you wish," he replied, "so long as it is yours and not something others have pressed into your throat." For a moment, the air between them was too full. Of what, neither could name. Then, without warning, Dorothea's gaze hardened. "This conversation is inappropriate." His jaw tightened. "So is the truth sometimes," and with that she turned and walked away. She did not run, but she walked faster than she had intended. That night, in the stillness of her study, Dorothea opened the drawer. The letter was still there, unsent. She unfolded it. She read it again, and again, and again. And when the tears came, they were silent. They left no trace on her face. Only on the paper, now stained in the lower corner with something no one else would ever see. She folded it once more and placed it back. The day began with quiet, a fragile, deceptive quiet, the kind that settles over old houses before something breaks. There was no wind, no bird song, no distant sound of hooves on stone. The sky was pale, almost colorless, a soft curtain drawn over the estate as if nature itself were holding its breath. Inside Ashworth House, the servants moved about their duties with the usual precision, though an undercurrent of restlessness pulsed just beneath the surface. Perhaps it was the change in the air, or the sleepless nights that had haunted the household of late. Or perhaps, though none would admit it aloud, it was the tension thickening between the Duchess and the cook, like a storm circling the rim of a glass. In the kitchen, Samuel Barrett stood by the long oak table, sleeves rolled, his expression calm but focused. The fire in the main hearth crackled as pots simmered and bread began to rise. Beside him, Molly Green moved efficiently, setting out bowls and trays, her eyes darting now and then to the scullery door, where she had last seen little Eliza Ashworth disappear with her doll clutched tightly under her arm. The snow had not melted. It clung to the ground in brittle silence, blanketing Ashworth House in a white that no longer seemed pure, but cold, sterile, like the linen laid atop a deathbed. The wind had shifted, bringing with it the murmurs of something that could no longer be ignored. Rumors, once mere whispers in corridors and shadows behind closed doors, now had voices. Loud, sharp, relentless. And at their center stood Dorothea, Duchess of Ashworth. She sat motionless at the edge of her dressing chair, her posture as perfect as ever, her dark mourning gown buttoned to the throat, as though defiance alone might keep the world from unraveling. The fire in her hearth burned low, but she had not asked for more wood, not because she didn't feel the cold, but because she no longer cared to resist it. The letter on her lap was written on thick parchment, sealed with the crest of the county magistrate. She had broken it open with steady fingers and read it only once. A formal petition had been filed. Lord Cedric Ashworth, under the pretense of concern, had requested a tribunal to evaluate the fitness of her guardianship over Edward and Eliza. The document was civil, correct, perfectly worded. It spoke of disturbances of judgment, undue influence by inappropriate relationships, and the declining moral example provided by the mother of two future heirs. In simpler terms, scandal. The very word Dorothea had spent a decade avoiding now wrapped itself around her like a shroud. She heard the knock at her door before it came. "Enter," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Miss Trumbull stepped in, the housekeeper's expression unreadable. She carried a tray with tea that neither of them truly believed would be touched. "They're speaking of it openly now," she said, setting it down. "I'm aware. They say you were seen entering the servants' wing, late, alone. Dorothea didn't move. "They say he's no ordinary cook, that he carries himself like a man with secrets, that he's deceived you, manipulated you. They've said worse about women who did far less." Miss Trumbull hesitated, and in that pause, just long enough, just sharp enough, Dorothea felt it. Doubt, not spoken, but present. "I see," Dorothea said softly, rising. "You may go." But Miss Trumbull did not leave immediately. She stood, hands clasped tightly in front of her, lips pressed to a line. There was no cruelty in her gaze, only discomfort, conflict. The line between duty and belief had begun to blur, and Dorothea knew she was alone again, truly, entirely, as she had once chosen to be. But now, the choice hurt. Downstairs, in the warm hush of the now-repaired kitchen, Samuel Barrett stood at the back table, folding his apron with care. His coat lay beside it. A small canvas satchel waited at his feet. He had not asked for explanation. He had not demanded answers. When she had come to him that morning, her face pale, her lips trembling but composed, he had known. "You must go," she had whispered. And he, with 1,000 words on his tongue, and not one that could change her mind, had simply nodded. Now his heart beat slowly, heavily, each thud an echo of something that should have been, but would not be. Molly burst into the kitchen, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her hands dusted with snow and flour. "You're leaving?" He looked up. She saw the answer in his eyes before he could say it. "No, you can't, not after everything." "She asked me to," he said simply, "and I will not make it harder for her than it already is. She's protecting you. She's destroying herself." They stood in silence. Then she stepped forward, her voice lower now. "Don't let her." He closed his eyes. In the servants' hall, 2 footmen murmured beneath their breath as he passed. Their stares were not malicious, but they held that sharp, familiar edge of judgment disguised as curiosity. In the upper wing, a governess had already arrived to escort the children to their lessons. Edward had not spoken at breakfast. Eliza had cried quietly into her napkin when Dorothea did not kiss her head. And the house, Ashworth House, felt as though it had exhaled and left her behind. The tribunal would be held in 3 days' time. Dorothea would be expected to appear in Bath before a small assembly of legal representatives and appointed witnesses. Lord Cedric had ensured the court would be private and dignified. He had said so himself in the letter delivered by his footman, signed in elegant black ink, with an apology for the necessity of such measures. Dorothea stared at the letter again, and this time her hand trembled. That night, the silence in the house was different. It was not the silence of power nor of control. It was the silence of grief. Dorothea paced her study. She no longer wore her jewels. Her hair hung loosely at her nape, unstyled. Her gown was plain, her feet bare upon the rug. And still, she paced. The fire crackled low, the shadows shifted on the walls. Her desk stood open, the drawer half pulled. The letter, the one she had written and never sent, remained beneath a stack of bills and correspondence. She stared at it, then closed the drawer. A knock at the door. She froze. "Mama!" It was Edward. She opened the door slowly. He stood there in his nightclothes, holding a small wooden soldier, eyes wide with worry. "Is it true?" he asked. "That they want to take us away?" She couldn't speak. "I heard the maids. I heard Cedric." Her knees buckled slightly, but she held firm. "Edward," she whispered, "I will never let anyone take you or your sister. Do you understand me?" He nodded slowly. "But why are they doing this?" She looked down at him, at his young face filled with too much knowledge and too little innocence. She knelt, pressing her hand to his cheek. "Because sometimes, when a woman refuses to bend, the world tries to break her." He threw his arms around her neck, and for a moment, just a moment, Dorothea allowed herself to weep. In silence, alone, with the only soul who had ever called her Mama without fear. In the servants' quarters, Samuel sat on the edge of his cot, his bag packed, but he had not yet stood. He stared at the door, waiting, not for her, but for something else. a reason, a sign, a choice. And for the first time in many years, he did not know which way to walk. "Molly," Samuel said without looking up, "check the back pantry. I smell something sharp." She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron as she moved toward the far end of the corridor. A moment later, the first scream echoed, not human, but metallic, a sharp hiss followed by a deep, ominous crackle. Then the smoke. It surged out of the pantry like a wounded animal, thick and black and choking. In an instant, the warmth of the kitchen turned violent. Flames licked the edges of the wooden shelves, jumping greedily toward the ceiling beams. "Fire!" Molly shouted, stumbling back. Samuel dropped the bread knife and rushed forward, grabbing a wool cloth and tossing it over a small blaze near the door. But it was too late. The fire had already climbed. It raced along the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling and roared to life. Servants screamed, buckets were summoned, doors flung open, and through the chaos, one voice cut through it all like a blade. "Eliza!" Molly spun toward the scullery. "I saw her go in there!" she gasped. Samuel didn't hesitate. He wrapped a damp towel around his mouth, grabbed a second one for his hand, and ran into the smoke. The world turned red and grey and blinding. Heat slammed into his body with the force of a hammer, but he pushed forward, following instinct and memory. "Eliza!" he called, his voice hoarse, a cough, then a sob. He turned toward the sound, nearly tripping over a fallen shelf. There, crouched behind a coal bin, was Eliza, her eyes wide with terror, her arms wrapped tightly around her doll, curls damp with sweat and ash. He reached her. "It's all right," he said, lowering himself. "I've got you." Her small arms clung to his neck as he lifted her, shielding her with his coat as he turned back. Smoke pressed against him from all sides, thick as velvet, suffocating. He stumbled once, his shoulder slamming into a doorframe, but he didn't stop. And then, light, voices, cool air, and Dorothea's scream, "Samuel!" She had never shouted his name before, not like this, not with the voice of a mother undone. He emerged from the smoke like something conjured from nightmare, his face streaked with soot, his shirt scorched at the hem, and in his arms, her daughter, limp but breathing. Dorothea ran to them, her composure in shreds. She took Eliza from him, her arms trembling, her eyes wild. "Eliza," she whispered, holding the girl tightly. "Oh, my darling girl." Samuel stood silent, panting, his hands burned, his skin blistered and shaking. Their eyes met, and there were no titles between them, no silence, no pretense, only what had nearly been lost. Later, the fire was controlled, the damage assessed, the west wing sealed. The doctor called to tend to Samuel's hands, to examine Eliza's lungs. Molly was the one who brought him to the servants' quarters, helped him sit, pressed a cool cloth to his brow. He said little. His strength, so unwavering in the moment of crisis, now trembled beneath the weight of pain. But when the door creaked open after midnight, he didn't need to look to know who it was. She entered quietly, wrapped in a dark wool cloak, her face pale, her hair loose from its usual braid, falling over one shoulder like spilled ink. Dorothea. She closed the door behind her. He rose slowly, but she lifted one hand. "Don't," she said softly. She stepped toward him. "I should thank you." He shook his head, his voice rough. "She's your daughter, there was never a question." She exhaled, and then her voice broke. "I've spent years building walls that no one could breach. I told myself it was for survival, for duty, for control. But today," her voice cracked, "today I felt nothing but terror." He stepped closer, her eyes shimmered. "And then I saw you." He reached out, not to touch, not yet, but to be near, to let her choose. And she did. She stepped into his arms, and he held her. Not as a duchess, not as a fallen woman, but as Dorothea. The silence between them was no longer a chasm, it was a bridge. Their lips met, softly at first, then with a depth that spoke of years unspoken. It was not a kiss of romance, it was a kiss of recognition, of grief, of two people who had carried too much for too long and had, for one blessed moment, found someone who understood the weight. When she pulled away, her hand lingered on his cheek. No words were needed. Outside, snow fell once more, gentle now, almost forgiving. And somewhere upstairs, in a forgotten drawer, the letter remained. Unsent, unread, but no longer needed to say what had already been felt. The morning light spilled gently through the tall windows of the study, diffused by the pale frost that clung to the glass. The fire in the hearth had long since turned to embers, and yet the room held a warmth, silent and golden, that seemed to hum beneath the surface. But Edward Ashworth, 12 years old and too thoughtful for his age, did not notice the glow. His gaze was fixed on the half-open drawer of his mother's writing desk. He had not meant to pry. He had come only to leave a folded drawing on the edge of her papers, a simple sketch of their garden in spring, where he had imagined his mother smiling. But the drawer had been left ajar, and from within, a single envelope peeked out, unmarked, sealed, forgotten. His fingers hesitated over it. Then, drawn by instinct and worry, he opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable, his mother's, but the words were not the ones he was used to. These were not the cold, measured phrases she spoke at dinner. These were full of longing, fear, regret, and love. By the time he finished reading, Edward's hands were trembling. He clutched the letter to his chest and ran. Down the staircase, past startled footmen, into the kitchen corridor where Molly stood peeling potatoes, her apron dusted with flour. "Molly!" he gasped, breathless. "Where's Mr. Barrett?" She turned, alarm blooming in her chest. "Gone! He left yesterday morning." Edward's face fell. "No, he can't be far. He can't. I have to find him." Molly wiped her hands, urgency rising with each second. "I'll go with you. And Eliza," Edward added suddenly. "She should come too. She always knows when Mama's heart is softest." Within the hour, the three of them were bundled in cloaks and scarves, stepping carefully along the frozen road that led toward the town. The snow crunched under their boots. The sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of more. They found him near the old blacksmith's cottage, his satchel slung over one shoulder, a letter in his coat pocket addressed to no one. When he turned and saw them, Edward breathless, Molly red-cheeked, and Eliza with tears frozen to her lashes, Samuel's expression crumbled into something he could no longer contain. Edward held out the letter. "She wrote this," he said, "but she never gave it to you." Samuel took the parchment with reverent hands. He did not open it, not yet, but closed his eyes, pressing it to his chest as if he could feel her heartbeat between the folds. "She's trying to protect you," Molly said quietly. "But she's breaking herself doing it," Edward added. Samuel looked between them, three souls tied to the woman he could not forget. "Come," he said at last, "there is something I must do first." By late afternoon, the wind had shifted. The heavy silence that had cloaked the estate was now pierced by murmurs in the village square where the magistrate's office stood, its steps swept clean despite the snow. Inside, Samuel stood before the council, his coat dusted with travel, the stolen ledgers in his hands. "I came to this house with the weight of silence," he said, voice steady, "but I will not leave in silence." Before the appointed magistrates, he laid bare the numbers, the names, the falsified invoices. He recited dates from memory. He described deliveries never made but paid for in gold. And at the center of it all, Lord Cedric Ashworth, the younger brother of the late Duke, the very man who had once petitioned for guardianship over Dorothea's children, stood at the back of the chamber, his jaw clenched, his gloved hands folded behind him. "I have no reason to lie," Samuel said, turning toward him. "I have no title, no land, no stake to claim, but I do have memory and truth, and your signature on every document you thought would remain hidden." There was a long pause. Then from the doorway, Dorothea entered. She wore no jewels, no corset. Her hair was pulled back simply, and her cloak was still dusted with snow. But when she walked down the aisle toward the front of the chamber, she did not look like a woman who had lost everything. She looked like a duchess. And more importantly, she looked like herself. "My Lord Magistrate," she said, her voice calm, unwavering. "May I speak?" He nodded. She turned, not to Cedric, not to Samuel, but to the assembly. "For years, I have carried my grief as a badge. I wore silence like a crown, believing that restraint was nobility, that coldness was strength, but I see now that silence is merely permission for others to speak for you." She let the weight of her words settle before continuing. "I have not failed my children. I have not endangered my household, but I have failed to defend myself until now, and for that, I take full responsibility." Then she looked at Cedric. "For too long, you have hidden behind my husband's name. But this house was never yours. It never will be." Cedric's face was stone. The magistrate conferred briefly with his advisors. Then he spoke. "It is the ruling of this council that the guardianship of Edward and Eliza Ashworth remains with their mother. Lord Cedric Ashworth is to be stripped of all administrative authority over the estate and barred from the premises indefinitely pending further investigation." A ripple of quiet satisfaction moved through the chamber. Samuel looked at Dorothea. Dorothea looked back, and neither spoke, not yet. Outside, snow began to fall again, softer now, without malice, as if the sky itself had been holding its breath and now exhaled in peace. That evening, Ashworth House did not feel like the same house. Candles flickered gently in the halls. The staff moved without the tension of yesterday pressing on their shoulders. And in the library, the fire crackled high, throwing golden light across the rug where Eliza lay reading with her doll tucked under her arm. Dorothea stood at the window, arms wrapped around herself, watching the snow settle against the glass. Behind her, footsteps, slow, measured. She turned, and Samuel stood in the doorway, no longer a guest, no longer a servant. He carried nothing with him, not his coat, not his satchel, not even the letter. He had left it where it belonged. She stepped forward, and for the first time in years, no words were needed. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer a shield. It was a beginning. The snow had begun to melt, not in torrents, nor in any dramatic display of spring's defiance, but gently beneath the quiet of a pale morning sky. Tiny rivulets of water slipped down the corners of the estate roof, tracing paths along the ivy-covered stones of Ashworth House. The frost that once held the grounds in icy silence had softened, giving way to earth and breath, and something else too, something almost forgotten: hope. Inside the house, the change was less visible, but no less real. The servants moved not with haste, but with purpose. The air no longer carried the weight of suspicion or restraint. Instead, it felt like something had exhaled at last, something that had been holding tension in its bones for far too long. In the entry hall, Miss Trumbull stood with her clipboard pressed to her chest, her posture upright as always. But her eyes had softened, and her mouth, habitually pursed in quiet judgment, was, for once, at rest. She looked out toward the staircase as if waiting for something, or someone. And when Dorothea descended, wearing a simple pale blue day gown with no embellishment save for a small silver brooch at the collar, her dark hair undone and falling over her shoulders in loose waves, Miss Trumbull lowered her head in a silent nod. No words were spoken. They were not needed. Dorothea walked past her slowly, with the calm of a woman who no longer needed to command silence because she had finally made peace with her own. She crossed the corridor and entered the kitchen wing, where the fire already crackled and the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread lingered in the air. The warmth welcomed her, not just in temperature, but in presence. And there he was, Samuel Barrett. He stood near the hearth, his back turned as he stirred a pot with one hand and held a cloth in the other. He wore no coat, no formal vest, only a rolled-up shirt as he always had, and the same quiet strength in his frame that had first unsettled and then slowly undone her. He turned at the sound of her steps, and their eyes met. Time, once again, stood still, though this time it did not carry the chill of hesitation, only stillness and recognition. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly. She stepped closer. I wasn't sure I could, until this morning. He watched her, searching her face not for doubt, but for what might still remain hidden beneath her serenity. Dorothea inhaled slowly, then said the words she had rehearsed only in her heart. "You saved my daughter," she said, "but that's not why I'm here." He tilted his head slightly, not speaking. "You saved this house from silence, from rot, from me." Her voice trembled, but only slightly. "You reminded my children what softness sounds like. You taught them that love doesn't have to whisper, and me, you reminded me I'm still a woman with a heart." He took one step toward her, and then another, and when they stood nearly chest to chest, she reached out, not as Duchess, not as penance, but simply as Dorothea, and placed her hand over his. "I came," she said, "to thank you for saving us, all of us." He turned his hand slowly beneath hers, letting their fingers interlace, and for the first time, he smiled. Not the courteous smile of a servant, not the solemn one of a man bound by secrets, but a smile of knowing, a smile of home. At that moment, the kitchen door burst open. "Eliza!" Dorothea exclaimed, startled. The girl rushed forward, her curls bouncing, her cheeks flushed with joy. She ran straight to Samuel and wrapped her arms around his waist, then looked up at her mother and beamed. "I knew you'd find him," she whispered. Dorothea knelt and pulled her daughter into her arms. "Did you now?" she murmured, kissing her forehead. A moment later, Edward appeared in the doorway, his hands tucked into the pockets of his waistcoat, his expression one of cautious optimism. His gaze met Samuel's, and the two shared a quiet understanding that needed no words. Samuel extended his arm. Edward walked toward them and stood beside his mother. And in that small, crowded kitchen, with the hearth crackling behind them and a loaf of bread rising gently in the oven, the four of them stood in stillness, hands clasped, hearts bare, not a single title between them, only the fragile warmth of something whole. Behind them, Molly peeked in. She saw the scene unfold, her hands still dusted in flour, and smiled with a mix of pride and relief. Her apron was new, neatly embroidered with her name. She had been officially promoted that morning, and though her hands had not yet grown used to the new responsibilities, her heart had already embraced them. She turned back down the corridor, humming under her breath. Later that evening, as the snow melted fully from the rooftops and the air began to smell of earth and thaw, Ashworth House came alive in a way it had not in many, many years. The parlor doors were opened, the curtains drawn wide, and somewhere in the distance a piano note rang out. It was not perfect, it trembled, but it was played with intention, and from the hall Samuel listened. He did not interrupt. He only smiled. For winter had not broken with thunder, nor departed with fury. It had thawed, and in its place something softer bloomed, something earned not by conquest, but by tenderness, by courage, by love. Epilogue. 5 winters later. Bath, England, the year of our Lord, 1867. Snow fell again upon Ashworth House, but this time it fell softly, like an old friend returning, no longer feared, no longer a burden. It kissed the windows with delicate frost, drifted lazily onto the stone balustrades, and shimmered on the branches of the ancient oaks lining the path to the main gates. The estate, though older now, stood prouder than ever, not because of its grandeur, but because of what it had survived. Inside, the house no longer echoed with silence. It pulsed with life. Laughter, footsteps, the occasional clatter of a wooden toy or a burst of music from the parlor. Dorothea Barrett, once the marble duchess, stood by the window of the nursery, her hands resting gently on the curve of her waist. Her dark hair, now streaked with the faintest silver at the temples, was pulled into a soft twist. She wore a gown of faded rose wool, modest but elegant, and her eyes, those once cold and distant eyes, were full of quiet wonder. In the crib beside her, a baby girl stirred in her sleep, no more than 3 weeks old, her cheeks pink and full, her tiny hands curled into fists. They had named her Clara Margaret Barrett. after two women who had once taught Dorothea how to feel again, one with silent loyalty, the other with the gift of listening. Behind her, a pair of arms slid gently around her waist. "You never tire of watching her," Samuel murmured against her shoulder. "I never thought I'd see her," Dorothea whispered back. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "And yet here she is." Their marriage, once the talk of scandal among Bath circles, had become a quiet mystery. People still whispered, less with outrage, more with a sort of wistful awe. No one could quite understand how a duchess and a former cook had built a life together. But they had. Not in defiance of society, but in quiet resistance to the idea that love must look a certain way to be real. Edward, now 17, had grown into a young man of conviction. He had chosen not to attend Eton, despite the pressure from extended family, and instead studied at home under the mentorship of Samuel, developing a keen mind for estate management and justice. He planned to attend university in London the following spring with his mother's blessing and a heart full of purpose. Eliza, 14, had taken up music once more. The pianoforte filled the halls again, not with mourning, but with joy. Her bond with Samuel was something deeper than stepfather or friend. He had become her safe harbor, the one who never asked her to be anything but herself. And as for Molly Green, now Mrs. Molly Lockhart, having married the new head gardener, she still helped with the household when needed, though most of her time was spent chasing her two young boys through the gardens she once only cleaned. She was no longer the trembling maid who scrubbed floors with red hands. She was fierce, confident and full of laughter. Miss Trumbull had retired 3 years prior. She left quietly, as she had lived, but not before pulling Dorothea aside on her final evening and saying with a rare softness, "You were always more than what they allowed you to be. I only regret I didn't see it sooner." Lord Cedric Ashworth had been exiled from Bath entirely. After the tribunal, more of his dealings surfaced, investments forged, debts unpaid, titles bartered for influence. He had been stripped of lands and power, left to wander Europe with only his name. But even names, it turned out, had limits when shame followed in their shadow. No one had heard from him in nearly 2 years. Ashworth House, under Dorothea and Samuel's stewardship, became a place of quiet generosity. Workers were treated with respect. Wages were raised. Orphans from the local parish school were invited each winter for warm meals and books. No grand proclamations were made. They simply did what they believed was right. And every winter when the snow came, Samuel would light the kitchen hearth, wrap his arms around Dorothea from behind, and whisper, "Do you remember that night?" And she would nod. Not because she wanted to remember the fire, but because that night everything had begun to thaw. The years had not erased the pain that came before, but they had softened its edges. What had begun in silence ended in warmth. What was once broken had been mended, not perfectly, but with golden seams strong enough to last. And so, as the snow fell and the hearth glowed, Ashworth House stood not just as a relic of noble titles, but as a monument to love that had been fought for, earned, and kept. For Dorothea and Samuel Barrett, love had not come easily, but 5 winters later, it remained. Steady, brave, and absolutely theirs. Sometimes love doesn't arrive in youth or in springtime. Sometimes it comes quietly, after grief, after silence, after we have stopped believing it possible. This was the story of Dorothea and Samuel, 2 wounded souls who found their way back to life, not through grand declarations, but through small acts of courage, through holding on when it was easier to let go, through daring to be seen when the world asked them to remain hidden. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most powerful kind of love, the kind you build, the kind you protect, the kind you choose, again and again. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments. What part moved you the most? Which character did you connect with? And if you made it all the way to this moment, write the word thawing in the comments. That one word tells us you stayed with us through every chapter, every whispered glance, every stolen moment. You are part of this story now. If you wish to support the small team that makes these timeless romances possible, we'd be deeply grateful for a super thanks of any amount. Every contribution helps us continue telling stories filled with emotion, history, and heart. But if that's not possible for you right now, sharing this video with a friend or loved one is just as meaningful. You never know who might need a story like this today. Before you go, don't forget to explore the related love stories we've left for you in the cards above. You may just find your next favorite tale waiting there, from our hearts to yours. Thank you for believing in love that heals, and stories that linger long after the last word is spoken. We'll be waiting for you in the next one.